The gavel struck once, sharp and final. In the quiet courtroom I stood, hands trembling, breath thin. They said I had sold my own house, the home my wife and I built with paint, laughter, and 40 years of memory. The attorney's voice was smooth, certain. On May 17th at 3:42 p.m., Mr. Henry Moore electronically signed the sale of his lake house. The judge nodded. Papers rustled. My sons avoided my eyes. Andrew looked at his shoes. Leon stared at the wall. For a moment I thought perhaps I had forgotten, perhaps they were right, and age had stolen another piece of me. Then I saw it, the unfinished painting. Leaning against the courtroom wall, sunlight spilling across its wet strokes, the same light from that afternoon. I whispered, barely audible. Even my own sons called me senile. But I remember every brushstroke of that day. Morning began the same way it always did, slow, quiet, and painted in soft light. The first thing I heard was the whisper of the lake brushing against the dock. The second was the kettle whistling to remind me I was still alive. I poured my coffee into the same chipped mug Lisa used to love, the one with the faded red sailboat, and sat by the window. The lake shimmered faintly, a mirror of the sky before sunrise. Every ripple caught a fragment of memory, Lisa's laughter echoing off the water, the splash of Emily's first swim, the sound of a hammer from the day we built this deck together. Sometimes when the fog drifted in, the house felt like it was floating between worlds, half in the past, half still trying to belong to the present. I stared at the old pier boards, gray from weather and time, and thought maybe things rot slower when they're loved enough. The view never changed, but it always felt new. Mist hovered above the water like breath, and the pine trees stood patient, unchanged by everything that had changed in me. Sometimes I imagined Lisa out there walking the pier, waving, laughing, always laughing. I picked up my brush, dipped it into the thin morning light, and traced a single line on the canvas. That was how every day began, quietly, faithfully. They say, solitude is peaceful, but they forget to mention how loud it can be. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a memory trying to speak. I found comfort in small routines, cleaning my brushes, folding the same dish towel, checking the mailbox even when I knew it would be empty. That morning, I didn't expect company, but the crunch of tires on gravel broke the rhythm. A silver SUV parked outside and two familiar silhouettes stepped out. Andrew walked ahead, suit pressed, tie perfect, carrying a phone that never left his hand. Leon followed, wearing sunglasses even though the clouds still covered the sun. He carried a briefcase, and I could smell cologne before the doorbell even rang. "Dad," Andrew said, smiling tightly as I opened the door. "This place is too much for you," Leon added, like we were picking up an old argument. I stepped aside. "You boys know where the kitchen is." They came in, filling the silence with their city voices. Andrew set his phone down, scrolling even as he spoke. "You shouldn't be alone out here, Dad. The stairs creak, the wiring's ancient. You could fall and no one would know." I poured coffee for them anyway. "You said the same thing last Christmas." He shrugged. "We just worry about you." Leon leaned forward. "Or maybe Mom wouldn't want you living like this." I turned slowly. "Your mother wanted this house to live, not to sell." That stopped them for a moment. Leon smiled the way salesmen smile when they know the customer won't buy, but they'll try anyway. "Dad, this place is valuable. You could sell it live near us. I can help with the paperwork." I stared out the window. Paperwork has a way of turning homes into numbers. They changed the subject after that sports market's politics. When they left, the house exhaled in relief. The silence returned like an old friend sitting beside me. I walked slowly through the hallway. The air still carried their cologne and tension, mixing with the faint scent of oil paint. The clock ticked with the rhythm of an empty house. I ran my hand along the stair rail, worn smooth by decades of living. "This house," I whispered, "you've seen us laugh, fight, fall apart, and still you stand." The floor creaked in reply, like it understood. Later that afternoon, Leon came back alone. He brought coffee just like he used to when he was in college. "Property taxes," he said casually, dropping a stack of papers on the table. "Let me handle it for you." I hesitated. He smiled reassuringly. "Just a few digital forms. You'll save yourself the headache." I nodded. I wanted to believe he was still the boy who helped his mother carry her canvases to dry in the sun. He logged into my iPad, typing faster than I could follow. "Need your Apple ID, Dad?" I told him, not thinking much of it. He plugged in a small USB drive, said it was an update. I remember saying technology moves faster than paint. He laughed. That's why you've got me. When he left, the smell of his cologne lingered longer than his kindness. That evening, I walked through the house, touching the walls like they were pages in an old diary. Lisa's studio remained just as she left it, the easel still stained with blue from her last work brushes in the jar beside the window. I stopped by the small bridge. She loved the one crossing over to the pier. The wood was worn smooth from her footsteps and mine. I ran my hand along the railing. You'd tell me if I was being foolish, wouldn't you? I whispered into the air. When I came back inside, the phone rang once, just one of those ghost calls that stop before you answer. I ignored it. The next morning, I received an email DocuSign. Your property sale has been confirmed. I frowned, confused. Spam, I thought, and deleted it. But that afternoon, someone knocked on the door. 2 men in polo shirts stood there holding clipboards. Mr. Moore, yes. We're here for the appraisal. The what? The new buyers asked us to check the foundation. I laughed, thinking it must be a mistake. I'm not selling this house. One of them glanced at his form. It's listed as pending under your name, sir. He showed me the printed page. Authorized by Henry M. I felt the world tilt slightly under my feet. I called Leon. Did you list the house? Relax, Dad, he said, laughing softly. It's just preliminary paperwork. Nothing's final. His tone was too easy, too smooth. I hung up, uneasy. That evening, Martha, my neighbor for 20 years, called to check on me. I saw a couple of men measuring your deck today, she said. You selling? No, I answered quickly. She paused. Oh, I thought maybe the boys finally convinced you. The silence after that was heavier than her words. That night, I sat in the studio. The moonlight spilled through the window and landed on the half-finished canvas. Lisa's old portrait stared back at me, her smile forever caught between joy and goodbye. She trusted everyone I whispered. Maybe that's why I still do. I reached for my phone. A new voicemail blinked. Leon's voice played calm, confident. Dad, maybe you forgot. You already agreed to the sale. I sat there long after the message ended, listening to the wind press against the glass. When the clock struck midnight, I opened my laptop and clicked the email again. There it was, the contract. Signed, electronically time-stamped, my name in blue, Henry Moore. The lake outside was still, but inside something broke quietly. For the first time, I doubted not my son's but my own mind. Before the house by the lake became quiet, it was alive with sound. Back then, when Lisa and I were young, everything we touched seemed to hum with promise. We met in a gallery in Burlington. She was standing in front of a landscape I'd painted years earlier, tracing the brushstrokes in the air with her finger. She turned to me and said, "You painted this light wrong." I was startled. Wrong? She smiled. "The sun wouldn't hit that side of the hill. You painted it like someone who's never stayed long enough to see the morning." That was the beginning. I spent the next 40 years trying to see mornings the way she did. We married in a small chapel that smelled of salt and pine. On our honeymoon, we drove past the lake for the first time and saw a piece of land for sale, 2 acres, nothing but trees and ski. Lisa looked at me and said, "If we build a house here, it has to have more windows than walls." And we did. We built it with our own hands, weekends filled with laughter, sawdust, and bad singing from the radio. She painted the walls pale blue to match the lake, and I carved our initials into the foundation beam before the floor was laid. We called it our forever place. Every season she changed the curtains, warm tones in winter, soft linen in summer. We hosted neighbors, students, old friends. There was always a smell of something baking and a record playing faintly in the background. Sometimes I'd come home from teaching to find her barefoot on the deck painting the horizon. She'd say, "The light's running away." Henry grab a brush, and we'd chase sunsets together like they were treasures that could vanish forever. Our first joint painting, the lake in spring, hung above the fireplace. We both signed it Henry and Lisa Moore. People said our signatures looked like 2 halves of one word. Then came the winter when the light began to fade. It started as a cough. Then the hospital visits, the whispers of doctors using words that didn't fit our world. Stage 3, aggressive, unresponsive. The house grew quieter, but not empty, just holding its breath. I moved a small easel into the hospital room. She hated the sterile light, so I brought our own lamp from the studio. I painted her every day, not her sickness, but her stillness, her strength. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and say, "Make me look alive, Henry." And I'd answer, "You never stopped being." she'd smile faintly. Then, promise me when I'm gone, keep painting. Don't let silence become your new canvas. On the night she died, snow was falling outside the hospital window. Her hand was small, fragile, but it squeezed mine once like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. I told her I'd keep my promise, but when I came home, the brushes felt heavier than grief. I left them where they were and turned the lights off in the studio. The funeral was quiet, just family and a few old friends. Andrew spoke first, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. Leon cried, but not for long. When everyone left, I stayed behind, standing by her grave until the wind erased my footprints. Back at the house, I covered her last canvas with a white sheet. Half her face was there, the left side glowing with life. The right side was blank, waiting for morning light that never came. I told myself I'd finish it when I could bear to look again. That day never came. The months that followed blurred together. The mail piled up, the garden overgrew, and the house seemed to echo even when I said nothing. Andrew and Leon tried to help at first. They brought groceries, fixed things, spoke softly like caretakers. But pity fades faster than love. By spring, they had stopped visiting as often. Calls became texts, texts became silence. For years, I lived like a ghost, moving through familiar rooms that no longer recognized me. I made coffee for two out of habit. I left a chair empty at the table, and sometimes I caught myself saying, "Pass the sugar, Lisa," before remembering. The house remained patient, holding its breath with me. Then one morning I heard a small knock on the door. When I opened it, sunlight spilled in, and behind it, a little girl with paint on her cheeks. "Grandpa," she shouted. Emily was 10. She looked like Lisa, the same wild curls, the same spark in her eyes that made the world seem possible again. She ran into the studio before I could stop her. "Why did you stop painting?" she asked, touching the dusty easel. "Because sometimes I said the colors hurt too much." She frowned, thinking. Then she handed me a wrinkled drawing of a flower. "Then paint something that doesn't hurt," she said. That night I picked up a brush again. The bristles were stiff like bones waking from sleep. But once I dipped them into blue, something loosened. By morning, the lake shimmered on canvas, and for the first time in years, I felt Lisa's presence not as pain, but as light. From then on, Emily became my anchor. Every visit she brought new colors, new laughter. We painted side by side, her strokes messy and fearless. Sometimes she'd fall asleep with paint still on her hands, and I'd cover her with a blanket smelling faintly of turpentine and childhood. She'd murmur, "Don't stop, Grandpa," even in her sleep. Those words kept me alive. Together we filled the walls with color again, portraits of birds, the dock, the old car Lisa once loved. Life returned in small doses like morning light sneaking through a half-closed curtain. I thought maybe the world had forgiven me for surviving. Then came the message that broke that peace. It was an ordinary afternoon tea cooling beside me, brushes drying in a jar. The phone blinked with a new voicemail. I pressed play. Leon's voice, calm and practiced, filled the room. "Dad, maybe you forgot? You already agreed to the sale." His tone was gentle, almost patronizing, like a nurse talking to a patient who's lost his mind. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I replayed it once, twice. Each time his voice sounded less like my son's and more like a stranger's. I tried to remember, had I clicked something by mistake, signed something? The thought clawed at me. Old age is a thief. It steals quietly, one memory at a time. I wondered if it had finally stolen mine. I stood by the window looking at the lake. The water was still the same stillness that once brought me peace, now mocking me with indifference. My reflection stared back, older, smaller, unsure. Maybe Leon was right. Maybe I really had forgotten. But then I saw the studio door cracked open, and inside the unfinished portrait of Lisa waited. Her painted eyes looked at me like she knew better, like she remembered for both of us. I walked inside, touched the edge of the canvas. Dust lifted into the air, catching the light. "I promised you I'd keep painting," I whispered. Maybe I should have promised I'd keep remembering too. I sat down, holding my head in my hands. Outside, the lake shimmered calm, eternal. Inside, I felt something breaking again. For years, I believed art could keep the dead alive. I never thought it would be the only thing left to prove that I was still among the living. That night, the lake was so still, it looked like glass. The moon floated across its surface like a memory refusing to sink. I walked down to the old pier, the board soft beneath my feet, and sat where Lisa used to wait for the morning light. The air was cold, the kind that makes you remember you're alive. I closed my eyes and could almost hear her voice again. "Don't let life turn into still water, Henry," she used to say. "Keep it moving, even if the current hurts." I whispered back into the dark. "You'd laugh if you saw what I've become," Lisa talking to ghosts and arguing with ink. The birch trees rustled softly behind me. They were the same ones that had witnessed our first sketch together when we drew the lake on napkins and called it forever. Now their branches trembled, scattering thin white bark like old confetti. I took off my gloves, dipped my fingers into the cold water, and felt something I hadn't in years: clarity. Maybe grief isn't meant to fade. Maybe it's meant to transform. The reflection of the house glimmered across the lake. It looked smaller than I remembered, almost fragile, but then I realized it wasn't the house that had changed. It was me. I stood brushing the dust off my coat and whispered, "If I can't keep you, Lisa, then I'll keep the promise instead." And for the first time since she died, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt full of her. The following week, I went to the bank. The young man behind the counter smiled the way people do when they're taught to be polite but not patient. I told him there'd been a mistake, that I hadn't authorized any sale, that the email I received was wrong. He tapped at his keyboard, nodding absently, then frowned. "It shows here, Mr. Moore, that you confirmed the transfer digitally. Everything's verified through DocuSign and your personal account." "That's impossible," I said. "I don't even know how to sign something like that." He chuckled softly. "Well, the system shows your signature and IP address." When I didn't laugh back, his tone changed. "Sir, maybe you should speak with your sons." Sometimes family handles these things jointly. The word jointly stung more than it should have. I looked at him, the polite smile, the pity in his eyes. People think pity is kindness, but it feels more like dismissal. I left without another word. Outside, the air was heavy with summer heat, the kind that smells of asphalt and betrayal. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, watching people come and go, so sure of where they were heading. When I got home, Leon was waiting. He was sitting on the porch steps, scrolling through his phone like a man who owned time. "Dad," he said lightly, "we need to talk." I didn't answer. He followed me inside. The house always told the truth about visitors. When Leon walked in, the floorboards creaked like they were warning me. He closed the door behind him. "Look, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what I'm supposed to think," I said. He sighed, took off his sunglasses. "We had to act fast. The market's good. I found a buyer who'll keep the place intact." "The place," I said, quietly. "You mean your mother's house?" "It's just property, Dad. It's the only thing she left behind that still breathes." He rolled his eyes. "Come on, this sentimental stuff." "Stop." My voice cracked through the room. "You forged my name." "I didn't forge it," he snapped. "You gave me your password." I froze. He smiled faintly, realizing he'd said too much. "You remember that day? Taxes, updates, whatever you told me, your Apple ID, you gave consent." The room seemed to tilt. I remembered that moment, the cologne, the USB, his quick fingers on my tablet. "You took advantage," I whispered. "I helped you," he shot back. "You just can't admit you can't manage things anymore." He walked toward the door, voice rising. "You've been living in this museum long enough. You're stuck in Mom's ghost. This house isn't her, it's a burden." Something inside me trembled, not anger, but grief sharpened into something colder. "Then maybe I am the burden," I said. He paused, jaw tight. "You said it, not me." And then he left. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, each step echoing louder than the last. The paintings seemed to watch me from the walls, silent witnesses to a truth too heavy to say aloud. Lisa's studio smelled faintly of turpentine and memory. I found the USB Leon had used, still lying on the table. It was small, black, unremarkable, like a weapon disguised as nothing. I plugged it into my laptop. Inside were folders: taxes, so 2022, deed, transfer signatures. My name appeared again and again, my digital signature copied perfectly like a ghost version of myself, agreeing to my own erasure. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. For the first time in my life, I wished Lisa were here, not to comfort me, but to tell me I wasn't crazy. I called Andrew the next morning. He sounded tired. "Dad, Leon told me you were upset." "Upset?" I said. "He stole our home." "Please don't say that." "Don't say what?" "The truth." He hesitated. "Leon said you gave permission. Maybe you just don't remember." I felt something inside me fracture. You think I'm losing my mind? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He sighed. Dad, you're making this harder than it has to be. We just want you safe. Leon's handling things let him. Safe, I repeated. You mean silent? He didn't answer. The line went dead. For 3 days, I didn't leave the house. Martha stopped by bringing her usual blueberry pie. She looked at the papers scattered across my table. Everything all right? Fine, I lied. Her eyes softened. You know your boys were here last Thursday. I saw their car parked near the pier. Last Thursday, I frowned. Afternoon around 3, they were carrying a box looked like one of those computer things. My chest tightened. That was the same time the DocuSign email had been sent. After she left, I stood by the window. The lake was calm again, as if mocking me for believing in peace. I could almost hear Lisa's voice. The truth doesn't hide, it waits. I called a lawyer, Arthur Klein, an old friend from college who owed me more than one favor. He listened quietly as I explained. When I finished, there was a long pause. Henry, he said finally, this is serious. If your sons forged your consent, that's fraud. But proving it will be hard. You'll need timestamps, IP logs, something physical. I have a USB, I said. That's a start. Don't touch it again. Bring it to me tomorrow. That night, I placed the USB in a small wooden box and locked it inside Lisa's old cabinet. The key still had her initials on the tag, LM. I thought that would bring me peace. It didn't. At midnight, I heard a sound outside, the soft thud of a car door closing. I looked out the window. Headlights flashed briefly, then darkness. The next morning, the box was gone. I searched every drawer, every room, every inch of the house. Nothing. My hands shook as I called Leon. Did you come here last night? What, no? Someone took something from my study. You probably misplaced it, he said calmly. Old houses eat things. Not this one, I snapped. He laughed quietly. Maybe you should get some rest. I sat there for a long while after hanging up, staring at the space where the box used to be. The air in the house had changed thicker somehow, as if the walls were holding their breath. I turned off every light and walked through each room slowly, one by one. The hallway creaked beneath my feet, the same sound Lisa used to call the house breathing. But that night it didn't sound like breathing. It sounded like warning. Outside, the wind howled across the lake, carrying faint echoes of movement, footsteps, tires on gravel I couldn't tell. I stepped onto the porch, the old wood moaning under my weight. The moon was hidden behind clouds, but the faint glow from the water threw shifting light across the yard. Something flickered near the shed, a brief flash like metal catching the light. I called out, "Who's there?" Only silence answered. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave me. The same cologne Leon wore seemed to linger faintly in the air. I knew it was impossible, he was miles away, but grief and paranoia have the same scent. I locked the door, checked every window, then sat by the fire without lighting it. The shadows on the wall seemed to move on their own. I told myself it was just the wind, but part of me knew better. That night I didn't sleep. I kept listening, waiting for the sound to come back. It never did. But by morning, I understood something that chilled me more than any ghost could. The house wasn't keeping me safe anymore. It was keeping secrets. I hung up my pulse hammering. That evening, Emily visited. She found me sitting on the porch, staring at the lake like it owed me answers. "Grandpa, what's wrong?" "Your father and uncle think I'm losing my mind." "Then prove you're not." "How?" She hesitated. "Show them what you see." Her words stayed with me. Show them what you see. I walked to the studio, pulled the sheet off Lisa's unfinished portrait, and began to paint again. Not her face, but the day it all began. The lake, the dock, the sky when Leon came with his briefcase, the sunlight that fell across the papers. My hands moved without thought. Each stroke felt like memory reclaiming itself from doubt. When I finished, I stepped back. The scene on the canvas was exact, the lake, the hour, the faint reflection of my son's car by the pier. But something strange caught my eye, a faint fingerprint smudged into the wet paint. It was mine near the corner next to a small streak of blue ink. Ink, not paint. I stared closer. The color was identical to the signature ink from the DocuSign printout. Emily peeked in. "Grandpa, that's beautiful. Why's your hand shaking?" I swallowed. Because I think this painting remembers what I can't. The next morning I brought the painting to Arthur's office. He leaned over it, fascinated. You painted this the day the contract was signed, yes. He studied the smudge. That's real ink printer ink, not pigment. How'd it get there? I told him everything. He nodded slowly. If the timestamp matches, this could disprove the signature's authenticity. You can't sign a document while physically painting. I frowned. But will a court even listen? They'll have to, he said. Truth leaves marks, Henry. You just have to show them where to look. That evening, Leon came again. He didn't knock this time, just walked in. Dad, we need to end this nonsense. Nonsense, I asked. You mean the truth? He crossed his arms. You're embarrassing yourself. The appraisal's done. The deal's ready. All you have to do is move out. Move out of my own house. It's not yours anymore, he said quietly. You signed it away. I pointed at the painting behind me. No, I was here, painting this, at the exact same time. He laughed. You think some picture proves anything, maybe not. I said, but it remembers better than you do. He turned to leave, muttering, You're losing it. Maybe I said, but if I am, I'm taking you with me. After he left, the house was silent again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt awake. I looked around and realized that every corner, every nail, every brush stroke held a record of what really happened. The house had been watching. And maybe, just maybe, it would speak when I couldn't. Emily found me there, hours later, staring at the painting. She placed her small hand on mine. Grandpa, what are you going to do? I looked at her and smiled faintly. I'm going to let the truth paint for itself. The night after Leon left, the lake was darker than I'd ever seen it. No moon, no stars, just a wide, empty shadow holding its breath. I sat by the window with the lights off, listening to the house settle into silence. When the wind touched the walls, it sounded like the sigh of something that had seen too much. I thought about Lisa, how she used to say that silence wasn't empty, it was honest. But that night it felt like the silence was on their side. The liars always have silence. It's the truth that struggles to be heard. I stood up and walked outside. The boards of the old deck groaned under my feet. The air smelled of pine and rain. Across the lake, lights shimmered from distant cabins, families still awake, still together. I wondered what they'd think if they saw an old man standing here talking to ghosts and shadows. I whispered into the darkness. Lisa, did I raise them wrong? Or did the world just teach them faster than I could? The only answer was the water lapping gently against the posts. The next morning, Emily came over with her backpack and a packet of cookies. She sat beside me on the porch, swinging her legs, studying my face the way children do when they sense adults are pretending to be fine. Grandpa? She said, Dad told me you're mad at him. I smiled sadly. I'm not mad. I'm tired. Tired of what? Of believing people always mean well. She frowned, unwrapping a cookie. Mom says when people lie, it's because they're scared. I nodded. Your mom's right, but sometimes lies don't come from fear. They come from forgetting what truth costs. Emily was quiet for a while. Then she asked, Why won't you sell the house? It's just wooden walls. I looked at the lake before answering. When your grandmother and I built this place, we buried a promise under that birch tree. A promise, yes. We wrote it on a small piece of canvas. Whoever stays keeps the light. What does it mean? It means this house isn't about money. It's about memory. Every nail, every paint stain, every creak in the floor, she touched it. Selling it would be like erasing her touch. Emily leaned her head against my shoulder. Then, don't erase it. I won't, I said. But inside I wondered if I still had the strength to fight everyone else who wanted me to. That afternoon I went through old photo albums. Lisa smiling with paint on her nose. Leon as a boy proud of his first birdhouse. Andrew holding Emily as a baby. Page after page I saw faces that had once belonged to love and time. Now they looked like evidence proof that kindness doesn't guarantee loyalty. I closed the book and sat in the stillness. For the first time in years I didn't feel old, I felt invisible. A thought struck me. Maybe this is what aging really means, not fading away, but watching the world forget who you were while you're still here. That evening, Emily and I took a walk along the pier. The sky was soft pink, the kind of color Lisa used to chase in her paintings. Emily looked up. Do you think Grandma can see us? I hope not, I said. She'd be furious at how badly I've managed things. Emily laughed. No, she'd say you're being dramatic. I smiled. She always said that. We stood there for a while, listening to the water. Then Emily said something that stopped me. Grandpa, if truth is like light, doesn't it always find a way through the cracks? I looked down at her and nodded slowly. Yes, but sometimes people build walls too thick for light to reach them. Then paint the cracks bigger, she said simply. She didn't know it, but those words anchored something in me. I realized I wasn't done yet. Not with this fight, not with this house, not with her faith. Later that night, I returned to the studio. The unfinished painting stood in the center of the room, lit by a single lamp. I stared at it for a long time. That fingerprint mine stained in blue seemed almost alive now, as if it had been waiting for me to understand. It wasn't just proof of innocence, it was proof of presence. I spoke softly to the canvas. You remember what I can't, don't you? The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was listening. I sat down and began to write notes for Arthur, dates, times, details about Leon's visit, the USB, Martha's sighting. But even as I wrote, doubt crept in. What if it wasn't enough? What if the court saw an old man chasing ghosts instead of justice? The pen hovered above the page. Lisa's words echoed, "Don't let silence become your new canvas." I looked around at the walls, every painting a story that had outlived its pain. Maybe that's what truth was, something you keep repainting until it finally dries right. I stood up and opened the window. The lake reflected the moonlight again, gentle, forgiving. In the glass, my reflection looked calm for the first time in months. Maybe it's not about proving them wrong, I said softly. Maybe it's about proving that I'm still here. Emily came to say goodnight. Grandpa, she asked, are you still sad? Sadness is just memory that won't sit still, I told her. She nodded, pretending to understand. Then maybe we can teach it to sit, she said. When she left, I laughed quietly to myself, the kind of laugh that shakes the dust off old grief. As the night deepened, I wrote one last line in my notebook. Silence may keep peace, but truth keeps faith. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The lab smelled of dust and cold metal. Rows of white lights hummed above as Emily and I stood beside a table lined with scanners and magnifiers. A woman in a gray lab coat adjusted her glasses. You're Mr. Moore, the artist. I nodded. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped the canvas. Under the fluorescent light, the colors looked sharper, almost defiant. She slid the painting under a spectral scanner. On the monitor, the layers of pigment bloomed in infrared shades. The pigment density shows sunlight exposure consistent with 3:30 to 3:50 p.m., she said. Now, this dark stain, she zoomed in, contains carbon-based ink, not oil, and it overlies wet pigment. Emily leaned forward, meaning, the expert straightened, meaning the ink touched the surface while the paint was still drying within minutes. So whatever made that mark happen while this was being painted. Her assistant compared the chemical sample from the printer. It's a match, he said. The woman turned to me. Mr. Moore, if this analysis holds, it's physically impossible that you signed any document at that time. You were painting. For a second, I forgot to breathe. Emily pressed her hands over her mouth, eyes wide. Then she whispered, Grandpa, your art saved you. I smiled faintly. No, darling, it saved the truth. We drove home in silence, the painting wrapped like fragile evidence in the back seat. The wind off the lake whistled through the car windows. I could see Lisa's reflection in every flash of water outside her calm face, the one that always believed in fairness. By the time we reached the house, dusk had already swallowed the shoreline. Inside, I sat by the phone and called Arthur Klein. His voice was gravelly but warm. Henry, he said, you sound alive again. I might be, I answered. We found proof, the painting, the ink, everything. I explained what the lab had said, the timestamps, the chemical match. Arthur paused. If that timeline is verified, we can reopen the case immediately. The electronic signature will collapse under forensic contradiction. I don't want to ruin my sons, I murmured. He replied softly. Justice isn't cruelty, Henry. It's clarity. For a long time, I said nothing. Then quietly, let's do it. That night, the house was too still. I poured tea but didn't drink it. Instead, I took out a pen and paper, real paper, the kind Lisa used for letters, and began to write. To my sons, I don't want revenge. I just want you to remember who built this house. You called it a property. Your mother and I called it home. If truth hurts you now, it's only because you buried it alive." I folded the letter, slid it beneath the unfinished painting, and whispered, "You'll find this when you're ready to see." Before going to bed, I stood by the window watching the faint glimmer of the lake. For the first time in months, it didn't look like a mirror. It looked like a witness. At dawn, Emily joined me on the porch. She wore the same yellow scarf her grandmother once made. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked. I shook my head. "Some truths don't let you." She smiled sadly. "Are you scared?" "Only of losing what's left of them," I said. "Then, let's make them face it." The drive to the courthouse was quiet. Morning fog wrapped around the road like slow-moving ghosts. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, flashing cameras, local artist disputes, digital sale of historic property. Arthur met us at the steps, briefcase in hand. "You ready?" "As ready as the truth," I replied. Inside, the courtroom was small but crowded. Leon sat with his lawyer, avoiding my eyes. Andrew fidgeted beside him, pale and restless. When I entered, a ripple of whispers filled the room. The opposing attorney stood first. "Your Honor, the evidence is straightforward. Mr. Moore's authenticated DocuSign bears his verified IP and timestamp. The sale was lawful and voluntary." Arthur rose calmly. "We respectfully contest that." He nodded toward the bailiff, who carried in the painting wrapped in linen. The courtroom murmured. Arthur faced the judge. "Your Honor, this exhibit was created at the exact minute of the alleged signature. Forensic analysis confirms the artist was painting, not signing." The attorney scoffed. "With all due respect, a painting is not a clock." Arthur smiled slightly. "No, counselor, but light is." He turned the monitor toward the judge, showing the digital scan. "The pigment layer matches natural daylight at 3:40 p.m., confirmed by environmental data from that day. The ink, identical to the one on the forged contract, was transferred to this surface while the paint was still wet." The room fell silent. Even the opposing lawyer leaned forward, speechless. Leon's face drained of color. Andrew stared at the floor. Emily clutched my hand under the table. The judge leaned back. "Mr. Moore, do you wish to speak?" I stood slowly. My voice trembled but held steady. "I only wish to remind the court that art doesn't lie. People do." Arthur placed a hand on my shoulder. The judge nodded gravely. "This hearing will recess for evidence review." As the gavel struck, I saw Leon glance my way, his expression hollow, as if seeing me for the first time. For once, there was no arrogance, no defense, just fear and something like regret. As the photographers flashed their cameras, Emily squeezed my hand. "You did it," she whispered. "Not yet," I said quietly. The truth just started breathing again. The news broke that afternoon. "Judge delays ruling after unexpected evidence," Emily read aloud from her phone as we sat by the window. Her voice trembled with pride. "They're saying your painting might redefine how digital contracts are authenticated." I smiled faintly, still staring at the lake. "Then maybe the world still remembers what a steady hand can do." "Are you disappointed they didn't close the case today?" she asked. I shook my head. "Truth doesn't rush, Emily. It waits. It always waits for the right moment to be seen." Outside, the clouds finally parted. Sunlight touched the lake, turning the water to gold. For a heartbeat, the reflection of the house glowed so bright it almost looked alive. That evening, a car pulled up the gravel road. Leon stepped out alone. He looked smaller somehow, his confident stride replaced by hesitation. For a long time, we just stood there, two men bound by blood and silence. He cleared his throat. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You meant enough," I said quietly. He looked down. "I thought I was protecting the family. I just didn't want everything to fall apart." "Then maybe it's time," I said, "to let it fall apart so it can stand honest again." He nodded once his eyes red. "I'll tell the court the truth," he whispered. "Not for me," I said. "Do it for the man you still want to be." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Dad, can you forgive me?" I looked past him toward the lake where the water met the sky. "I can forgive," I said softly, "but I won't forget what forgetting costs." Later that night, I went to the studio. The unfinished painting stood by the window, bathed in silver light. One flake of dried paint had fallen away, revealing a glimmer of blue ink beneath the same ink that once condemned me. Now it felt almost like a heartbeat. I touched the canvas gently. "You kept the truth from me, old friend." Emily appeared in the doorway. "Grandpa, the reporters want to know what happens next." I smiled. "Let them ask. The house will answer." The lake shimmered quietly, the house glowing in its reflection as if it had finally spoken. Some homes speak louder than words. You just have to listen. As I turned off the lights and stepped away from the window, the lake caught one last trace of moonlight, soft, steady, and forgiving. For years I thought truth was something you fought for. But now I know it's something you live with, even when it hurts. The house groaned softly, like it was exhaling after a long confession. Tomorrow there would be more questions, more papers, more noise. But tonight, there was peace. I whispered into the quiet. "Thank you, Lisa, for teaching me that even silence can tell the truth." The water shimmered once more, then stilled completely, like a signature drying on the world itself. And somewhere between the echo and the stillness, I finally felt free. And if this story found its way to your heart, tell me, would you forgive your child if they tried to erase your past? Share your thoughts below. And if you believe truth always finds its light, subscribe and join us for the next story on Echoes of Betrayal. Thank you for watching.